Tutankhamun's tomb curse is legendary. Discovered in 1922, killed explorers like Lord Carnarvon, spun tales of supernatural vengeance. But get this, the curse wasn't supernatural at all, because the real curse was etched in Tut's genes, a royal bloodline poisoned by inbreeding, dooming a boy king and his entire dynasty.
Picture this. Deep beneath the scorching sands of the Valley of the Kings, in the year 1922, Howard Carter's lantern pierces the ancient darkness. The air is thick with dust and forgotten secrets, heavy as the weight of millennia. As the sealed door cracks open, a curse seems to whisper from the shadows. Not the supernatural vengeance spun by modern myths, but a revelation buried in bone and blood. Inside lies the golden mask of a boy king, his features serene in eternal repose, masking a body twisted by betrayal from within. This is Tutankhamun, the pharaoh who bore a cursed legacy, born not from God's wrath, but from royal blood poisoned by generations of inbreeding. In the heart of Egypt's 18th dynasty, around 1341 BCE, the new kingdom shimmered like the sun god Ra himself, vast empires stretching from Nubia to the horizons, temples towering in divine splendor. Pharaohs ruled as living gods, their bloodlines deemed sacred, untouchable. Yet this obsession with purity birthed a darkness. Marriages between siblings, cousins, even parents and children, echoing the myths of Osiris and Isis, brother and sister, who forged the divine order. It was no mere tradition, it was a political chain, binding power within the family, warding off outsiders from the throne. But what they called divine was doomed, a genetic labyrinth folding in on itself like a coiled asp ready to strike. Tutankhamun, son of Akhenaten, the heretic who shattered Egypt's pantheon for the sole worship of Aten, and his full sister, the younger lady, emerged into the world, fragile, malformed, a silent warning cradled in royal linen. DNA whispers from 2010 studies, echoed in 2025 analyses, reveal an inbreeding coefficient sharper than a sibling bond today, amplifying recessive horrors, skeletal deformities, weakened immunity, a dynasty rotting from its core. The curse of his tomb, blamed for deaths like Lord Carnarvon's infected bite or ergot-tainted heir, was mere coincidence, a myth amplified by 1922 whispers. No, the true curse was etched in his genes, a legacy that would doom Tut and unravel an empire. And it all began with a birth in the shadows of Amarna, where a queen gave life to a pharaoh destined to embody extinction. Royal blood. That phrase echoed through the halls of Thebes like a sacred incantation. But unspoken was the truth. It wasn't just divine, it was poisoned, twisted upon itself like the Nile's murky depths. Generation after generation, pharaohs sealed their fate with unions too close, too confined, a snake devouring its own tail. And at the center stood the 18th dynasty, Egypt's most glorious yet biologically damned. The 18th dynasty stood as Egypt's golden zenith, a radiant epoch from 1550 to 1292 BCE, where pharaohs carved their names into eternity. Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun's grandfather, stretched the empire's arms across Nubia and Mitanni, his wealth gilding temples that pierced the heavens like obelisks to the sun god Ra. Thebes pulsed with life, its markets humming, its priests chanting in the shadowed halls of Karnak. Yet beneath this splendor lurked a fatal flaw, a secret coiled in the royal bloodline like a serpent waiting to strike. The pharaohs, revered as living gods, believed their power could only be preserved through purity, through blood untainted by outsiders. They turned to the myths for justification. Osiris and Isis, divine siblings who birthed Horus, the falcon god, in a union sacred and unchallenged. So too, the pharaohs wed their own, sisters, cousins, even daughters, to lock the throne within the family, to keep the divine spark unpolluted. But what they called purity was poison, a genetic knot tightening with every generation. Amenhotep III, the great conqueror, married his daughter Sitamun, entwining the royal line further. His son, Akhenaten, the heretic who dared to cast aside Egypt's gods for the singular worship of Aten, took his full sister, known only as the younger lady, as a bride. Their union was no anomaly. It was policy, a deliberate choice to mirror the gods, to defy the laws of nature. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's famed queen, may herself have been his half-sister or cousin, her lineage tangled in the same web. The court celebrated these unions with incense and hymns, blind to the warnings whispered in the Nile's flow. DNA studies, unearthed in 2010 by Zahi Hawass and reaffirmed in 2025, peeled back the veil. Tutankhamun, born of Akhenaten and his sister, carried an inbreeding coefficient higher than siblings in modern times, a homozygosity that turned recessive genes into dominant curses. Harmful traits, once hidden, now surfaced like crocodiles from the river depths. Skeletal deformities, weakened immunity, vulnerabilities passed down from great-grandparents, Yuya and Thuya, through Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, who were likely cousins themselves. This pattern wasn't unique to the 18th dynasty. Echoes rang in later eras, like the Ptolemaic pharaohs, where Cleopatra VII wed her brothers. But it peaked in the Amarna period, circa 1353 to 1336 BCE, named for Akhenaten's radical capital, Akhetaten. Here, religious upheaval met genetic collapse. Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution shattered temples, alienated priests, and sowed instability, all while his bloodline withered. The inbreeding amplified risks, high infant mortality, frailty that no ritual could mend. Tut's grandparents and parents shared genetic material denser than parent and child, a labyrinth where harmful alleles looped endlessly. Portraits from Amarna show elongated skulls, exaggerated features. The so-called Amarna style wasn't just art. It was a visible scar, a jawline distorted, a frame fragile, hinting at the weaknesses, infertility, and early deaths lurking beneath the gilded surface. The court ignored these signs, deeming them divine quirks, inconvenient truths buried under layers of denial. By the time Tut was conceived, the dynasty was a genetic dead end, a tree not branching but curling inward like a noose of reeds around its own throat. They rejoiced at his birth, an heir to continue the line, blind to the fact that the line had poisoned itself beyond salvation. The child they swaddled in linen was no savior. He was a harbinger, the culmination of centuries where blood purity trumped all. And as Akhenaten's sun disk Aten blazed overhead, the shadows of doom lengthened. The empire needed a strong pharaoh, but what emerged was a boy whose body would betray him from the cradle. In the palaces of Amarna, the whispers began, not of Aten's glory, but of something wrong. The queen, Akhenaten's sister, labored in silence, the air thick with incense and fear. Midwives emerged pale, their hands trembling, muttering of a child, not right. Tutankhamun didn't cry with vigor. His wail was weak, gurgling, as if the Nile itself choked him. His limbs were limp, his frame slight, a head too large for his fragile neck. Yet the priests bowed, the nobles applauded, for he was royal, divine by blood. What none dared say aloud was what all saw. This infant was a warning, the result of a bloodline so obsessed with itself it had bred fragility into fate. They pretended it was fine, that the boy who couldn't grasp, couldn't focus, was destined to rule the two lands. But behind the veils, the truth festered. He was not just a baby, he was a curse crowned in gold. And the dynasty would shape itself around him, denying the obvious, elevating a broken vessel to the throne it was never meant to bear. From the moment Tutankhamun drew his first breath around 1341 BCE, his body whispered of betrayal. Born into the opulent shadows of Amarna, the radical city his father Akhenaten built to honor Aten, the boy entered a world of gilded illusions. His mother, the younger lady, Akhenaten's full sister, lay exhausted, her labor a trial in the incense-laden birthing chamber. Midwives hovered like vultures, their faces paling as they beheld the infant. He did not wail with the vigor of a god-king. His cry was feeble, gurgling, as if the Nile's waters filled his lungs. His limbs hung limp, his skin a sickly pallor like faded papyrus, his head disproportionately large atop a frail neck that pulsed unnaturally under torchlight. At first glance, he seemed delicate, malformed, strangely silent. His left foot twisted inward in a clubfoot deformity, pes equinovarus, rendering his steps a future shambling gait. His right foot bore oligodactyly, missing toe bones, a silent scar from the genetic storm within. And yet the priests bowed low, the nobles murmured praises, for he was royal, a descendant of the Sand's divine line, heir to the two lands. But what none voiced was the horror etched in his form. This child was no divine promise. He was a curse incarnate, the fruit of a bloodline so intertwined it had woven its own noose of lotus. The court physicians scrambled, reassuring the royal family with incantations and herbs. They claimed he was merely weak, that time and the gods' favor would strengthen him, that miracles bloomed in pharaonic households. But no miracle descended from Aten's rays. Tutankhamun was not simply ill, he was the endpoint of generations who deemed themselves above nature's laws. A genetic cul-de-sac given a scepter, and still, they called him divine, draped him in linen finer than clouds, adorned him with scarab amulets of gold. They celebrated his birth as if he were Egypt's salvation. In truth, he was its omen, a boy whose bones softened improperly, whose frame stood at a mere 167 centimeters, slender and slight, betraying the robust warriors of legend. As an infant, he struggled to nurse, his cleft hard palate, a partial split in the roof of his mouth, making every swallow a battle. As a toddler, his first steps came late, uncertain, propped by over 130 canes, later found worn in his tomb, KV 62, silent witnesses to his frailty. He didn't walk until well past the age of God's chosen. When he did, it was with a limp that made courtiers avert their eyes, ashamed to gaze upon their future ruler. Yet, the empire clapped and chanted, pretending all was ordained. Because to admit flaw in Tutankhamun was to confess rot in the entire 18th dynasty. So they lied, dressing fragility in grandeur. They dubbed his silences profound, not symptomatic of deeper woes. They proclaimed his delays as signs of celestial mystery, not a mind clouded by fever's veil. Behind palace walls, however, the illusion cracked. Tutors despaired over a child who stared blankly at flickering oil lamps, or traced hieroglyphs on papyrus scrolls, as if they held escape from his prison of flesh. He was slow to learn, perhaps, incapable of the sharp focus his forebears wielded like kopjes. Loud rituals disturbed him. Bright sunlight from Aten's disk overwhelmed his senses. There were moments of inexplicable distress, possibly seized, though science remains unsure, or the relentless assaults of malaria, Plasmodium falciparum, coursing through his veins like a Nile flood. DNA revealed multiple strains, inherited vulnerabilities from ancestors like Yuya, Thuya, and Amenhotep III, making him prone to fevers that racked his body, high temperatures that left him listless, immune system crumbling like eroding sandstone. He suffered Köhler disease too, a vascular necrosis gnawing at his foot bones, denying blood supply, causing pain that no balm could soothe. Mild kyphoscoliosis curved his spine subtly, an overbite jutted his teeth like the Thutmose lineage's mark. And through it all, the court performed its grotesque theatre. Priests hovered, chanting for his health. Attendants mopped his brow during bouts of fatigue. His survival was no triumph of strength but grim endurance, a political spectacle where a broken boy was paraded as Pharaoh in waiting. Akhenaten, lost in his Aten devotion, ruled through this haze, his son's frailty a shadow ignored amid religious fervor. Queen Tia, Tut's grandmother, wielded influence from afar, but even she could not mend what blood had wrought. When Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, the boy king ascended at 9 years old, circa 1332 BCE, renamed Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, to restore the old gods shattered by his father's heresy. He sat upon the throne like a ghost in linen, eyes glassy, body trembling under the weight of the double crown. The regents, perhaps his grandfather, and Horemheb, the general, whispered commands, signed decrees in his name, using the child's fragile form as a shield for their power. Every public appearance saw him slumped in a golden litter, head lolling. The people reminded, the Pharaoh lives, and so does Egypt. Even as both rotted from within. At court, the air turned febrile. Ministers spoke in hushed tones. Priests lingered like omens of death. Tut was sequestered in scented chambers to mask the odor of his infections. His linens changed frequently as fevers soaked them through. Portraits were crafted as flattering deceptions. Strong limbs, confident gaze, the hint of a warrior's stride. They erased the clubfoot, the limp, the vacant stare that betrayed the truth. The boy king was crumbling, but he must be presented, believed in, for there was no other heir. The dynasty had gambled everything on this fragile vessel. They needed him to endure, to marry, to sire sons. Even as his bones ached and his mind wandered, the whispers plotted his future. He will wed his half-sister, produce heirs, extend the line. But deep in the palaces, they knew Tutankhamun wasn't saving the dynasty, he was its punishment. As he grew, the boundary between pharaoh and puppet blurred. Dressed in finery, positioned on thrones, presented to the masses, but never truly reigning. He perched like a relic, gurgling faintly, trembling under the crown that sat heavy on a skull never fully formed. The court mastered deception, a skill honed over centuries, but never had the charade been so fragile, so absurd, as under Tutankhamun. They weren't just deceiving the people, they were fooling themselves. For the truth was unbearable. The boy they enthroned was no king. He was a decaying form with a divine title. And Egypt had become a stage, propping up the illusion that all was eternal. The alabaster halls of Thebes glittered with candlelight and deception, a theater of denial where truth was buried beneath layers of ritual and gold. Tutankhamun, crowned at 9, was no longer just a boy. He was a symbol, a fragile relic, propped up to preserve an empire teetering on collapse. By 1332 BCE, the boy king sat upon the throne of the two lands, his double crown glinting under the sun of Amun, restored to appease the gods his father Akhenaten had forsaken. Yet, beneath the linen robes and jeweled collars, his body betrayed him daily. His clubfoot dragged with every painful step, his spine curved under kyphoscoliosis, his bones ached with the necrosis of choler disease too. Malaria, that relentless Nile-borne plague, surged through his veins, its multiple strains confirmed by DNA whispers from 2010 and 2025, leaving him fevered, listless, his immune system crumbling like the sandstone cliffs of Amarna. The court painted over these truths, portraying him as a warrior pharaoh, hunting lions, driving chariots. But the over 130 canes in his tomb, worn from use, told a different story. A king who could barely walk, let alone wage war. The empire demanded a ruler, but what they had was a marionette. The cunning vizier, and perhaps Tut's grandfather, and Horemheb, the iron-fisted general, pulled the strings behind the throne. They whispered orders, signed decrees in his name, wielded power through a boy who stared vacantly at flickering oil lamps or clutched lotus chains as if they held answers. His silences were called wisdom, his fevers communion with Ra. If he stumbled, they named it divine contemplation. If he seized, possibly, though science remains unsure, they claimed he danced with gods. The court became a stage, every priest, noble, and attendant an actor in a grotesque charade. They bowed to a pharaoh whose eyes twitched with exhaustion, whose lips struggled to form words through a cleft palate. Yet they clapped, they chanted, they pretended, because to admit the truth would unravel the myth of divine kingship. The greatest fiction was marriage. The dynasty needed an heir, a son to stretch the poisoned bloodline further. So, at the dawn of his reign, Tut was wed to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She was no stranger, raised in the same tangled web of Amarna's inbreeding, her beauty immortalized in art, but her fate bound to tragedy. The union, sealed around 1332 BCE, was a ritual of continuity, a desperate bid to mirror Osiris and Isis, to keep the throne sacred. The court rejoiced, envisioning sons to carry the 18th dynasty forward, but nature had no such plans. The couple's two daughters, preserved as mummies 317A and 317B in Tut's tomb, were stillborn, one at 5 months, the other at 9. CT scans revealed their horrors: spina bifida splitting their spines, scoliosis twisting their frames, limbs malformed by the same genetic curse that plagued their father. Tutankhamun was sterile, his body ravaged by malaria and skeletal decay, incapable of producing life. The court physicians tried everything: herbs from the Nile's banks, scarab amulets inscribed with spells, lotus blooms offered to Hathor for fertility, but no potion could undo what centuries of inbreeding had wrought. Ankhesenamun withered beside him, her hope fading with each stillborn child. The court, desperate to maintain the illusion, turned to superstition. Tut's ailments were no mere illness. They were divine punishment, a curse from Aten's scorned light, or the wrath of old gods spurned by Akhenaten's heresy. In the shadowed halls of Karnak, priests chanted ceaselessly, their voices rising like smoke to banish unseen demons. They poured holy water from the Nile over Tut's trembling frame, burned myrrh to drive out evil spirits, performed exorcisms under starlit skies. Some whispered of a sorcerer's hex, others of enemies, Mitanni or Hittite, cursing the boy king's blood. No one dared name the true culprit, a bloodline so knotted it choked itself. Tut, vacant and frail, believed the lies, clutching scarab amulets to ward off phantoms, his mind clouded by fever's veil. His attendants shielded him from mirrors, fearing he'd see the truth in his own reflection. A pharaoh crumbling, a dynasty dying. The court's theater grew frantic. Ai and Horemheb tightened their grip, manipulating every decree, every ritual. When Tut faltered in public, slumped in his golden litter, they called it divine trance. When he babbled incoherently, hands trembling on his goblet, they nodded solemnly, interpreting nonsense as prophecy. Artisans carved his image with strength he never possessed. Broad shoulders, steady gaze, a chariot-riding warrior. Foreign envoys, expecting majesty, found instead a boy with a fevered gaze, unable to lift a scepter without trembling. One Hittite scribe wrote, "I know not what horrifies more, the king or the lies they weave around him." Yet the court persisted, kissing his ring, chanting his titles, Lord of the Two Lands, Son of Ra, because there was no alternative. The dynasty had staked everything on this broken boy. They needed him to live, to wed, to sire, but deep down, they knew Tutankhamun was no savior. He was the end. When Ankhesenamun's despair deepened, she acted in secret. After Tut's death, letters from the Amarna archives suggest she begged the Hittite king Suppiluliuma for a prince, Zananza, to marry and save Egypt from collapse. The prince was sent but vanished, likely murdered, on the road, plunging Egypt into diplomatic chaos. Ankhesenamun disappeared from history, perhaps forced into marriage with Ai, her fate as shrouded as the Nile's mists. The court, meanwhile, doubled its efforts, staging banquets, where Tut sat listless, musicians playing for a king who stared into the void. A priest once slipped, muttering, "This is a kingdom ruled by a relic." He was gone by dawn. The empire was fraying. Nubia slipped from grasp. Mitanni alliances crumbled. Whispers of rebellion stirred. Tutankhamun remained the silent center, a sun in a dying cosmos, his every breath a miracle, his every twitch divine. But the truth was inescapable. The boy king was not ruling, he was rotting, and with him, the 18th dynasty crumbled. The sandstone halls of Thebes were a mausoleum of illusions, their echoes filled with chants and denials as Tutankhamun's body faltered under the weight of his crown. By 1323 BCE, at the age of 19, the boy king was a fading ember, his life a slow collapse sustained only by the court's relentless performance. His skin, once pale as papyrus, took on a waxy yellow hue, like a candle burned too long. His bones, softened by Kola disease too, ached with every movement, his clubfoot dragging like a chain forged by his own bloodline. Malaria, that relentless Nile-borne plague, ravaged him. Multiple strains of Plasmodium falciparum, confirmed by DNA whispers from 2010 and reaffirmed in 2025, surged through his veins, igniting fevers that left him trembling, his immune system a ruin crumbling like Amarna's abandoned temples. His eyes, clouded by fever's veil, perhaps unproven early ailments, twitched in their sockets, searching for an escape from the prison of his flesh. And still, he was propped up, dressed in linen robes, the double crown fitted upon a head too frail to bear it. The court called him divine, but he was a sacred corpse, breathing only by grim inertia. The end came swiftly, yet no one was prepared. Around 1323 BCE, Tutankhamun's body succumbed, not to assassins' blades or chariot mishaps as some once whispered, but to a brutal convergence of ailments. A broken leg, likely from a fall during a hunt, festered into gangrene, its infection seeping into his blood, combined with malaria's relentless assaults, confirmed as the decisive blow by modern studies, it triggered a fatal immune shock. His heart, perhaps weakened, beat its last. His lungs, strained by fever, gasped and stilled. The court's illusion shattered in silence. No grand last words, no divine proclamations, only a boy's rasping breath fading beneath heavy linen sheets, surrounded by scarab amulets and incense that could not save him. Priests hovered, their prayers a desperate refrain, as if words could hold back death. Attendants wept, not for love, but for fear of what his passing meant. The end of a bloodline, the unraveling of an empire. The tomb, KV-62, was prepared in haste, its walls unfinished, its chambers stuffed with over 5,000 treasures. Golden masks, worn canes, a legacy of splendor masking a hurried burial. The curse of the tomb, born in 1922 when Howard Carter unearthed it, was a modern myth, spun from Lord Carnarvon's death by an infected mosquito bite and exaggerated inscriptions about death on swift wings. Scholars now point to coincidence, perhaps ergotism from tomb fungi, but no supernatural wrath. The true curse lay in Tut's bones, revealed by CT scans and DNA, a leg blackened by necrosis, a frame twisted by inbreeding, a dynasty doomed by its own purity. His autopsy, pieced together by modern science, painted a grotesque portrait. No evidence of a murderous blow, no chariot crash, just a body eroded by genetic failure and disease, weighing barely enough to fill his golden sarcophagus. With Tutankhamun's death, the 18th dynasty gasped its last. He left no sons, no heirs to carry the poisoned blood forward. His half-sister and wife, Ankhesenamun, stood alone, her pleas to the Hittite king for a prince, Zananza, ending in his mysterious death on the road, a murder that sparked whispers of war and betrayal. She vanished, perhaps forced into marriage with Ai, the vizier who claimed the throne from 1323 to 1319 BCE. I's reign was brief, a flicker before Horemheb, a commoner turned general, seized power from 1319 to 1292 BCE. Horemheb erased Amarna's legacy, smashing Akhenaten's statues, restoring the old gods, paving the way for the 19th dynasty under Ramses I. Egypt's empire frayed. Nubia slipped away, Mitanni alliances collapsed, and whispers of rebellion grew into roars. The Amarna period, once a bold experiment in monotheism, was buried like its boy king, its dreams of eternity scattered like sand. The court's theatre could no longer hold. Tutankhamun's death was not just a loss of a king, but the collapse of a myth. The bloodline that had ruled the two lands for centuries ended in a tomb too small for its ambitions. The bells of Thebes tolled, but the people, weary from famine and taxes, offered no tears. They exhaled, as if a long-held breath had finally escaped. Across the Mediterranean, foreign powers circled like vultures, sensing weakness. Egypt was no longer a beacon. It was a Senate board, its divine king. A fallen piece swept from the game. The war of succession loomed, alliances shifted, and the two lands stood on the brink. Tutankhamun, crowned in hope, died in silence. His name, a whisper of extinction. Tutankhamun's final breath slipped away in the darkened chambers of Thebes, beneath heavy linen sheets scented with myrrh and despair. The boy king, barely 19, lay surrounded by scarab amulets and fading prayers, his eyes no longer focusing, his lips muttering fragments of childhood or broken hymns to gods he could not name. The court stood silent, their chants stilled, as if they had rehearsed this moment for years, because they had. His death in 1323 BCE was no sudden tragedy. It was the culmination of a dynasty's slow decay, a bloodline that had devoured itself through centuries of arrogance. The air grew thick with the weight of an empire's end, not with the clash of swords or the wail of mourners, but with a quiet that felt too vast to fill. Tutankhamun was not just a pharaoh. He was extinction, the last ember of the 18th dynasty snuffed out by its own poisoned blood. His legacy, sealed in the rush tomb of KV62, would sleep for millennia until 1922, when Howard Carter's lantern pierced the Valley of the Kings. The golden mask, serene and eternal, sparked a global fever. Egyptology was born, museums filled, the world captivated by a boy king's splendor. Films like The Mummy in 1932 wove his myth into modern lore, while Cairo's treasures told of a grandeur that never truly was. Reconstructions in 2023, with 3D faces mirroring modern Egyptians' medium brown skin, peeled back the illusion, revealing not a god, but a frail boy, his features etched with pain. Modern science, CT scans, DNA from 2010 and 2025, laid bare the true curse, not supernatural vengeance, but inbreeding's toll. Malaria and a gangrenous leg, not assassins or curses, stole his life. His stillborn daughters, twisted by spina bifida and scoliosis, were not divine trials, but genetic failures, the dynasty's final notes played on a broken string. Tutankhamun was no tyrant, no monster, but a victim, a living artifact of a system that prized blood over merit. His reign, a mere 9 years, was no triumph of conquest or glory, but a caution carved in bone. The 18th dynasty, once a beacon across Nubia and Mitanni, crumbled not from enemies without but from rot within. When kings believe themselves gods, when bloodlines become chains, empires pay the price. Horemheb's erasure of Amarna, the rise of Ramses I, the wars and losses that followed, all stemmed from a boy too broken to bear the crown. History remembers pharaohs for their pyramids, their victories, their gilded tombs. Tutankhamun left no such monuments, only a warning. When power becomes an inheritance rather than a responsibility, it devours itself. The sands of Egypt reclaimed his name, his dynasty, his dreams of eternity. And in their place, a truth emerged, stark as the desert sun. No god-king is above nature's laws. Subscribe for more tales from the sands, where empires rise and fall, and blood writes its own epitaph.